This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining me tonight. A little presentation here about our Seeing Levees Save Lives program. I'm Kevin King. I'm the general manager for RD1000. I joined the district in the spring of 2019. And you all have been invited tonight as I received correspondence from all of you over the course of the last 2, maybe 3 weeks, opting out of the district's project for the vegetation modification. Many of you have received postcards and notifications. I wanted to reach out one last time to make sure that you all have the information that you need, especially if you haven't been able to attend one of the prior community meetings, that you have the information that you need to make that decision in opting out of the district's funding program to address the high hazard encroachments on Garden Highways. So I'll walk through briefly some of the background. If you haven't attended a previous community meeting, I would encourage you to go back and look through the videos and the meeting materials that are available on our Seeing Levees Save Lives portion of our district website. So I won't spend a lot of time going through the background tonight, as we've previously done that, and those resources are available. So thank you all again for joining me tonight. I just wanted to reach out again, specifically to those that had sent us correspondence to opt out of our program. Background information: the Seeing Levees Save Lives project. The project intent is to reestablish the access and visibility to be compliant with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Operations and Maintenance Manual, as well as requirements from the Central Iowa Flood Protection Board. The Sacramento River East Side Levee is one of the first lines of defense in preventing exterior floodwater from entering into the Natomas Basin, particularly along Garden Highway. This is well known to all of you who live on the levee and have endured high water events in the Sacramento River and seen flooding over the last few decades along that stretch, or threatened floodwaters entering the basin, maybe even perhaps on your own property. RD1000's approach to address flood risks and the myriad requirements as a local agency responsible for the well-being of the community, in particular for flood protection. There's a lot of regulatory agencies that govern, and partnerships that RD1000 has as a local maintaining agency and the local resource for all of the constituents of the Natomas Basin. There's a lot of parties involved, whether it's FEMA, the Central Iowa Flood Protection Board, Department of Water Resources, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, and the City and County of Sacramento as the floodplain managers. There's a lot of coordination that happens to keep Natomas safe from floods. And so I want to talk a little bit first. One of the primary objectives and one of the agencies we coordinate with a lot, and one of the standards and obligations we have to meet, is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and what their role is and how things have evolved particularly over the last decade and a half. So in 2010, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers performed their periodic inspection, and they concluded that the system was unacceptable due to encroachments and vegetation. At that point, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decertified the levees that surround the Natomas Basin. So there's 42 miles of exterior levee system, decertified the exterior levee system, and essentially put a moratorium on Natomas for development and anything to expand the risks to the population for Natomas until certain items were addressed. In 2013, they performed a reinspection. The most concerning part of that, encroachment and erosion deficiencies, have been, have been repaired. The overall system rating, though, is still at that point was still minimally acceptable. So the moratorium was lifted and things were allowed to continue because there were multiple initiatives in place to provide funding to fortify the exterior levee system. However, it was noted in that 2013 reinspection that vegetation and encroachments continue to be unacceptable.
I'm on a Zoom meeting.
I'm sorry, if you guys can all mute, getting a little bit of
Yeah, I'm
feedback
talking
here.
to him. I mean, I'm listening.
Sorry, if you guys can all go ahead and mute, that'd be great because we're getting some feedback from all of you, or from some of you. But continued progress on the vegetation and encroachment maintenance was necessary and should be completed during the 2-year time period between the approval of our letter of intent and the approval of the SWIFT. So I'm going to take a moment here and just mute everyone, and then I'll open everyone back up. I'm not sure who's keying up here, so be patient. Almost there. All right, so the 2013 periodic reinspection identified 197 unacceptable encroachments. You can see from the picture here in the map and the dots, the Sacramento River East Side Levee had a significant portion of those, and you can see from I-5 down to essentially downtown Sacramento, there's a number of properties here that had unacceptable ratings for encroachments. Since 2013 reinspection and what we've been working on with SAFEGA, the Corps, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, was to acknowledge the fact that the levee system is currently being fortified, and that the waterside access and visibility standards and updating the operations and maintenance manual to recognize the strengthened levee system post completion of the Natomas Levee Basin Improvement Project was that, and this is still in draft form, but we have some assurance that this is what's going to be acceptable from the Corps moving forward. They were fine with some waterside access and visibility standards recognizing the strengthened levee, but with the condition that visibility and access was maintained. The vegetation variance allows for vegetation to remain on the waterside slope with the condition that adequate access and visibility are maintained. And so let's talk briefly about what's currently in and going through approval and review with the Corps. This is the vegetative variance directly out of the supplement to Part 3. It calls for various zones of vegetation and what's allowed in those various zones. And so I know this is very busy, but I'd encourage you, this is posted on our Seeing Levees Save Lives portion of our webpage. But I encourage you to follow up later on to get, really detailed or zoom in to this information in this slide. But this is what the Corps is currently under review. We have talked to the Corps most recently. They've closed the chapter on the review of the vegetative variance, and they're working on other chapters of the O&M manual update. So we feel that the Corps is communicating to us that they've closed discussion. This is what's going to be included in the operations and maintenance manual when and if it gets approved. This vegetative variance directly from their internal working documents and what they're reviewing is not as restrictive as the current operations and maintenance manual. So if the updated O&M manual takes some time to review or doesn't get implemented, The current O&M manual is still in place and still effective, which is more restrictive and doesn't recognize the strengthened levee and the vegetative variance here that's shown. The other regulatory agency and partner of the district is the Centralized Flood Protection Board. So on the state level, RD 1000 has an obligation to work with the Centralized Flood Protection Board as the local maintaining agency, obviously again for flood protection. So I just want to go through briefly here what the state's been telling us. So we talked about the federal requirements in the Corps' 2010 and 2013 system inspection reports and the various requirements. The Centralized Flood Protection Board performs 2 inspections of the district's system, one in the fall and one in the spring every year. Most recently, the fall 2021 inspection report identified numerous encroachments, primarily vegetative and access and visibility issues, and gave us a minimally acceptable rating. However, the landscape vegetation prevents the ability to see waterside slope and will make it difficult to access for a flood fight. This was their most recent inspection in the fall of 2021. We don't have the spring inspection report available to us yet. And so you can just see this is just a screenshot of some of the issues and noted in that inspection and report. And so here's another example. You can see the access and visibility requirements here with the vegetation right along the fog line and not being able to see down the levee slope presents a problem and something that the district must address as an unacceptable rating. Another slide here with similar examples. So RD 1000's approach, given the Corps and the Centralized Flood Protection Board through their various inspections and surveys to address the issues of the unacceptable ratings and the high potential in our minimally acceptable rating, we've reached out. We started this program in January of this year to work with the property owners plus RD 1000 for us collectively to come into compliance. So RD 1000 has secured grant funding from the state through the Flood Maintenance Assistance Program. We have about almost $500,000 this year that we're making available to property owners to come into compliance with the various standards. The encroachments that are on your property are the responsibility of the landowner to address, and specifically if there's a permit and if they're unpermitted, we think there's 2 paths for you as property owners, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But we do have funding available for this year. We're fortunate to make that available to the property owners to come into compliance with that requirement. So at the May 2022 Board of Trustees meeting, staff presented and the board approved a contract with Emerald Site Services, the district's contractor, to work through the high hazard encroachments this summer and use the FMAP funds to do so. And so the district's direction to the contractor is to clear vegetation within 3 feet of the fog line, and then also except for low-lying ground cover that complies with Title 23, and also trim the lower tree limbs and remove or trim shrubs and hedges so that RD 1000 can reestablish the needed sight lines to visually inspect and access the majority of the levee slope, primarily in the area from 3 to 10 feet of the fog line. And so this is a graphical representation here of what we're asking for. The top right portion here, if you envision this as Garden Highway, you can see the cypress trees blocking the view in front of the residential property, and numerous shrubs and plantings that prevent us from seeing the levee slope. And so as you move further down, just behind the white truck here, the field division requiring access down to the toe of the levee slope. So we're literally talking about modification and trimming up so we can see in and around and access should we need to do a flood fight, but continually monitor the levee slope to ensure that there are no arising issues that would prevent the performance of the exterior levee system. So what does compliance look like? I've shown this picture a couple times. This is a property, obviously non-residential here on the left. We have really good access and visibility down to, all the way actually down to the river, but certainly can see the levee slope. This is another property here on Garden Highway that has some landscaping there, but we're able to see in and around. This property could fall out of compliance in the future if it's not maintained to this level of trimming and landscape maintenance. Non-compliance looks like this, and this is a picture directly from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board fall and spring levee inspection reports. So these are the issues they're asking us to address, and similarly affirmed by the Corps' inspection in 2013 to address these access and visibility issues. Obviously, RD 1000 staff can't see or access this property to ensure the integrity of the levee slope down towards the river. We've started this program in January this year to reach out. We've had 2 community meetings, one in February, one in April. We've responded to numerous requests for information to provide you all with the opportunity to, essentially learn what we know to be, and the documentation and how we led to the point that we are at today. And then project implementation. So the board awarded the construction contract at the May meeting, and our contractor initiated that project on June 6th. So just this Monday, we started with the modification of the vegetation, the landscape vegetation that prevents us access and visibility. So that kicked off on Monday. I do want to talk about next steps. So the project kicked off, like I said, on Monday. We have to be complete with all of the project modifications per the grant agreement for the FMAP funds by essentially November 15th, so we get all final invoicing in and then submit documentation back to the state to make sure that we're processed and verify the expenditures. And we have to have that completed by the end of this calendar year. So December 31st, we have to submit all of our documentation back to the state to take use and ensure that the project's wrapped up, all expenditures are done by the first of the year. So what RD 1000 is proposing to do, this is a rendering that we have included and put out. This is a before picture and an after picture. This is a graphical representation of what the modifications would look like. So this was pre-project implementation of, kind of the extent of what we're asking for during this summer. I do have some pictures from this week. So here's a before and after photo. You can see that the oleanders have been trimmed back significantly, and we're reestablishing the access and visibility through the wrought iron gate. Significantly notable is that the wrought iron gate and fence is barely visible in the before picture, and now we're reestablishing, post the work of our contractor. So the next steps, and the reason why I'm reaching out again tonight and invited you to attend the meeting, is that I received your emails. I wanted to acknowledge your emails to opting in or opting out. I wanted to give you one last opportunity. I shouldn't say one last opportunity. I wanted to give you another opportunity to engage with the district so you could hear firsthand from the district and what we see as 2 paths forward to you as property owners along the Sacramento River East Side Levee, particularly on the water side, is that we're offering to fund this program this summer with about $500,000 that would substantially get us towards the goal of compliance, both for you and for the district, to meet the Corps' O&M manual and to meet the requirements from Title 23. And so we have this funding available. If you opt in, we will be out on site. The best we can do schedule-wise is give you about a week ahead of time. And so we're sending out those, and we'll be on site, during the course of that week. So some properties take a little bit longer than others, and so we can't guarantee we'll be there at 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning, but we'll be there sometime during the week. And so if you opt in, our contractor will be on site. We have a district representative there, and anything comes up, feel free to address the contractor, and they'll get a hold of either Gabe Holloman, who's our operations manager, or myself directly, and we'll be out on site within a matter of minutes to explain what's going on. If you opt out, I can't guarantee what that path looks like and what the expense would be. RD 1000 would obviously step back from that, but what we see moving forward is that it's not a matter of if, but when compliance needs to be achieved. And I feel personally that I wanted you all to know that we don't think it's a matter of if, but when. Obviously, we have the funding to do it now. We're local, we're here. Gabe and I are, working on this every day. But if it goes the route of, state and federal enforcement, we don't know what that path looks like for you as the property owner. And so we want to make this opportunity. If you have submitted an opt-out letter and hadn't attended or haven't been in communication and want to now opt in, please let me know as soon as you can. And Gabe and I will certainly get in touch with you and see where we're at on our contractor schedule, as they just started this week. We probably can include you back again and readdress this. But I do want to caution all of you, in my perspective, moving forward, the state enforcement or federal enforcement action, in my mind, isn't favorable for all of you and could be costly. And so thank you all for joining me tonight. Again, we're trying to work collaboratively together with you guys, and it doesn't have to be adversarial in any means. We're just providing you with the options to move forward. So I'll open it up for input and discussion at this point, and I'd ask that it's difficult for me to monitor the chat. I doing this here, I get distracted, but if you have questions or comments, please feel free to join in now. And I also, before you do that, I do want to let you know that I do have a number of my staff members and consultants and regulators on the call tonight. So feel free to ask a question, find out more information. If I can't answer it from a technical standpoint, I'll refer to some of my team members. So, floor is yours. And I did mute most of you. If you have a question or comment, you'll need to unmute, and we'll go from there.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you're heard.
Well, first of all, sir, thank you for doing this presentation. I do wish you had done it before you ambushed us with that letter in January, however. That certainly makes it difficult to accept the assertion that this is somehow going to be collaborative. I have yet to hear a compelling case as to why any of this is necessary, given the new, very strong levy, which we all support. And two words that I did not hear in this presentation, and which I believe are words that distinguish your agency from the State Flood Control Protection Board, are due process. Due process. And so we are still talking here, even though you say you want to be collaborative, about a unilateral decision that was sprung on us without any prior notice or opportunity for participation. If you are serious about a truly collaborative approach, I think probably there are a lot of us who would very much welcome that. That's really what we've been pleading for since we got this letter in January. but I would appreciate any further thoughts you might care to express about what you mean by collaborative here.
And along with that, we had Gabe to our property the day after receiving your letter in January. You keep referring to access and visibility. We have complete access to our yard, very wide open driveways, no gates, no fence. We have a line of oleander. We said we'd be willing to trim them up a foot or so from the bottom so you could see the dirt. And his answer was no, they all have to go.
Yeah,
Kevin,
so
would it be helpful for me to perhaps speak to the due process issue?
yes, Scott, please.
Right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Shapiro, and along with Rebecca Smith, who's also on the line, we act as general counsel for the agency. And I guess I first want to say that I used to live in River Park, which some of you may know is a community that also has a levee adjacent to it. And I actually lived along the levee. And there was a time in which American River Flood Control District reached out to me as a property owner and others and spoke about the fact that we had encroachments on the district levees which needed to be removed. And I share that to commiserate, to acknowledge as a property owner how difficult these things can be, and to say that we're not heartless, none of us, including Kevin and especially the RD 1000 board. But on the due process issue, due process is before something is imposed upon you against your will. And that's not happening here because there is an opt-out ability for you. I will also note that this circumstance is best analogized to what happens when SMUD needs to come and trim the trees that are in their easement that are affecting their power lines. They hang a flyer on your door. They don't give you the ability to opt out. They tell you they're going to come sometime in the next week. They tell you that they're going to come on their property your property if they need to. And they tell you that you really have no control over what they trim. RD 1000 has done far more than that. RD 1000 has had numerous community meetings and outreach and has also given you the ability to opt out. So I don't want to negate how you're feeling, but from a legal due process aspect, this isn't a due process issue. I defer to Rick Reinhardt, who's a consultant, and Kevin King to maybe address this other half of your question, which was the compelling reason.
May I just respond briefly to that? First of all, I'm not considering this to be a court of law or making a technical or purporting to make a technical due process issue. I simply point out that what you are representing as outreach and consultation all came after the fact, after you made this decision, not before. I'd now be happy to hear what the compelling substantive justification is for doing this, given that we have this great new levee, which now will be doing the work that's required for flood protection.
Rick, would you like to go ahead and address the compelling reason, and then I'll talk again about the collaborative process and the outreach that the district's been doing. So Rick, if you can address the technical portion of that question.
Sure, happy to. This is Rick Reinhardt. I'm with MBK Engineers. I'm a consultant that supports the district. I'm also the certifying engineer for FEMA and the state's urban levee criteria, both of which need to occur at the completion of the Natomas project when the Corps completes the levee improvements. First, RD 1000 didn't develop these standards. The Army Corps of Engineers did with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board as part of completion of the work that SAFECA did with the adjacent levee. So RD 1000 is implementing what the Corps has come up with. This isn't a negotiation with RD 1000 because they didn't write these standards. The reason the Corps wrote it is that the Garden Highway, even though an adjacent levee was built on the land side of the Garden Highway remains a part of the flood protection feature. It's defined as a part of the flood protection system, and the Corps, when approving the vegetation variance, as Kevin pointed out, said that we're fine leaving the bulk of the vegetation so long as access and visibility is maintained. And what they're looking for is erosion, primarily. That the existing levee is made of non-cohesive sands, meaning that when it starts to erode, it erodes very rapidly, and that will jeopardize the adjacent levee. And with the large population living in Natomas, and the billions of dollars in damageable property, the Corps wants a very low risk for that erosion occurring. And so we're not talking about a standard that removes vegetation only, that as they're driving the levee in an extreme flood event, like a Superstorm Sandy or a Katrina or a Harvey, that, you know, that level of flood event, something we've never seen here in the Central Valley, that we're able to patrol this levee. And if something starts to give way with erosion, trees blowing over, that RD 1000 can work with the state and Army Corps of Engineers to take emergency action and avoid a levee failure. I think that's all I have to address that point.
Thanks, Rick. As far as the outreach and collaborative approach, as I mentioned earlier, I started the district in 2019. I think in the email invitation that I sent out to all of you tonight is that you can imagine that there's a lot of things that get caught up to speed on for levee protection. And so one of those things that became apparent during the course of the last 2.5 years is that we'll need to address this issue specifically with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the updated O&M manual, that we have to do this after the letter of intent and post-project completion. We have to continue to make progress towards levee encroachments, access and visibility issues to this standard. And so this was known. I can't change the fact of the outreach or what's been communicated from the various agencies with all of you for the last decade and a half. I certainly sympathize with all of you for the impacts that you've had on your property and your standard of living over the last decade and a half since the levee improvement project's been initiated, right? Whether it's construction noise, traffic delays, seeing friends and neighbors' property acquired for the setback levy. But what I can tell you is that we reached out in January this year, knowing that we are looking at a 2025 deadline for the completion of the Natomas Levee Improvement Project. And so at that point, the district has this obligation, and what we are fearful of are numerous issues, but primarily the flood protection and assurance of the 120,000 plus and rapidly growing residents of Natomas, ensuring that we maintain compliance and eligibility for federal disaster relief funding through FEMA, and also that all the investment that's been made to date, whether it's from you all through assessments that you've paid to SAFECA or requirements in federal appropriations that we all pay for to provide the funding for the exterior levee improvement project, is that the assurance or kind of the hope was that we would get out of having flood insurance and flood protection if we meet that 200-year flood protection. We cannot recertify the levees in post-completion of that project without meeting these standards, whether it's the Corps' O&M, updated O&M with the vegetative variance, or Title 23 for the Centralized Flood Protection Board. And we continually receive, whether it's the fall or spring inspection report, unacceptable ratings. And so this isn't the obligation of RD 1000. As an individual property owner, your encroachments and the landscape, all of those encroachments or the landscaping needs to be permitted. And so we're actually offering this assistance, and again, reaching out again tonight. You are fully available to continue to opt out. I don't know what the time frame is or what the cost will be, but we have, me and district staff and consultants are fairly certain that, again, it's not if but when to come into compliance with the Corps manual and Title 23 requirements. And so I'm just cautioning about opening that door for enforcement action as opposed to participating in our program where we're going to fund a portion of this. Ongoing maintenance is obviously the responsibility of the property owners, but I just want to stress that we're offering this assistance program. I can apologize that, the district didn't start this 10 years ago, but we are where we are today. The funding's available right now, and I think it behooves you and the district to take advantage of that funding opportunity.
I believe there's more questions.
Neil has a question. What is Title 23?
Angelis, are you still there?
Yes, good evening, everyone. That's the California Code of Regulations, Title 23, Division 1. That's the standards that the Central Valley Flood Protection uses for regulating encroachments on federal levees.
Where does that come from?
They're under the California Code of Regulations. They're public regulations. I can provide the link on the chat for anyone that can access them.
I have a question, Kevin.
Go ahead. Who's next?
Kevin, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I don't know who's speaking. There's a new.
Sorry, it's Matt.
So just go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I have a question. So as far as seeing levees saving lives, what's the next step for property owners that have, say, houses up on the levee or fill or existing permitted walls, structures that even if you remove the vegetation, you're still not going to see the levee?
Yeah, so Pat, it's a really great question. What we're trying to address this summer and taking advantage of the DWR funding through the FMAP program is to address what's most critical.
No, I understand what you're trying to address now. I'm just more concerned down the line, as far as if this is the concern now and being able to see that levee is that important for the Army Corps. What is their next step or your next step as far as, I mean, there's a number of houses that are built almost in the levee and they're permitted.
So what I was trying to get to, and if you'd allow me to finish addressing that in steps, is that the district has submitted their SWIFT, which is a system-wide investment framework, to address the unacceptable ratings and come into compliance. And so what we intend to do, and this is what we've asked over the last 2 years with MBK implementing the FMAP programs, the grant funding that we've received in excess of $3.5 million over the last, since I arrived in 2019 to address some of the things. One of those line items is the SWIFT implementation. And so what we're attempting to do, and what the 2019 survey that MBK performed on encroachments on the Sacramento River East Side Levee, with identification of different classifications and categories as far as assessment risk or hazard risk, we're trying to address currently the zeros and ones, which are the 100 high hazard encroachments. Moving forward, the district wants to continue to work with the community to address all of the encroachments that are identified and need to come into compliance. We don't know what that time frame is. I'm hoping, based on availability of funding, based on project approach, based on the availability of resources, whether it's staffing or community engagement, that we can buy ourselves some time over the next 5 to 10 years. But there are approximately 600 different encroachments that we need to address. And so the district is that resource on police with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, the enforcement chief, she just spoke. The district has a direct relationship with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and can work with the property owners if you are willing to work with us in addressing these things. We do have a time crunch right now and the availability of funding, but ongoing, whether it's the Corps' O&M manual or Title 23, and that's where, kind of in these next steps, if we go back to the next steps here, it's ongoing maintenance. And so I showed you a couple slides earlier about the property. Gosh, sorry guys. That the next step is ongoing encroachment maintenance. The district doesn't necessarily have this in their funding or program that is paid for, because it is an ongoing requirement of the property owner to meet Title 23 and the Corps' manual. But we want to work together with all of you and start this dialogue and develop the personal relationship to address these things as we move forward to ensure flood protection and maintain status in PL 8499 for federal disaster relief, as well as ensuring the district's continued insurability, because the fall and spring levee inspection reports plus the Corps' periodic inspections, we have unacceptable ratings. And so we want to make sure that we're all protected, and to the extent that future grant funds are made available to the district, we're applying for. In fact, we just submitted last week for FMAP funds for next year. There's no guarantee for that award, but we would continue to again make that money available for the deferred maintenance of the federal levee system, and potentially be able to do some more encroachment work down the road. We can help and review all the permits that you have on file with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and walk through and expedite the process. So I'm not sure who's, we got a lot of feedback going on. So if you're not actively speaking, please mute again. Thank you.
Kevin, I know you're not monitoring the chat. So Mr. Ward, who asked that previous question, posted in the chat trying to get an understanding of whether currently permitted structures would be removed in the future. And I know we can't predict everything, but I wonder if Rick Reinhardt, who has at least reviewed what the encroachments are that have been identified, is able to at least speak to some of the big picture issues like houses. If houses are permitted, are those the kinds of things that the board or the Corps is looking to deal with?
Scott, before Rick jumps in there, I do want to talk briefly about the nature of permits. The nature of permits are revocable. The permits that I've reviewed for residential properties or the properties along Garden Highway, for anything that's been permitted in the past, is that there is a condition that it has to meet current and future state and federal requirements. And so to the extent that the state or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers determines that it needs to be restored to no encroachments, RD 1000 obviously can't guarantee that, but by nature, permits are revocable. And so, so that's a caution, but what we feel very strongly about, what we'll advocate for, is the protection of those permitted structures, and to ensure that you remain as property owners in compliance with those and walk through. What I can't guarantee is that if we eventually have to provide a notice of violation to you as a property owner, which gets copied to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board for enforcement of the notice of violation, they then take over the enforcement action at that point. If there is anything, and so they'll open that that book and they're going to look at your property for all permitted structures. They're going to come and do an inspection, and they're going to investigate what has been permitted and what has not been permitted. And potentially it could be more than just the landscaping issue and access and visibility standards. It could be for anything that was done prior to your ownership or since your ownership that they would then look to make sure that you have a permit for, and that can be a lengthy, expensive process, whether it's a cultural survey, whether it's structural engineering design, and inspection. I just caution you that that's a likelihood that could happen if it gets turned over for enforcement. So go ahead, Rick, if you want to add on.
Yeah, there's a lot there that you hit on, Kevin. I'm glad you did. So right now as Kevin said, we're focused on landscaping. We're not looking at structures. We've identified the high hazard vegetation. I think 97 of them are landscaping, and 3 of them are fences that have not been constructed in compliance with Title 23 and are not see-through. But there are, I think, 600 and something encroachments that ultimately need to be addressed that Kevin said. I'm not expecting any concerns with structures that are permitted. What could be a problem is if someone has a shed or an outbuilding that was constructed without a permit. That would be a problem, and that would need to be addressed. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be removed, but it would have to go through the permit process. And I think it's important to point out is MBK also works for property owners and other districts to help come into compliance with enforcement action. And depending on the level of compliance that needs to be met, just our fees, just the consultant cost to assist a property owner to go through that process is anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 that the property owner pays to come in compliance when the enforcement action starts. And Kevin hit on a really important point that right now we're focused on access and visibility. We're not focused on addressing all of the deficiencies with the property that are identified in the periodic inspections. When the board starts the enforcement process, they tend to focus on all of the deficiencies, everything that's not permitted, everything that's not in compliance with the permit. And so it's a much more onerous process than what the district has proposed here. The district's proposing just the minimum to address what is high hazard. Hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if I missed a point there.
No, that does. My follow-up would be, are there any provisions made for properties that are, say, I can think of 3 to 4 that are under violation, however, have massive already FEMA approved retaining walls or of the like? So regardless of what vegetation is removed, you're never going to see even the river, let alone the levee. I ask this as a board member.
So you're asking for properties with waterside fill, where there's essentially you don't see the levee at all. There's fill.
Yeah,
on the water.
fill is.
I think that's called creating feedback. I'm not sure if you could mute call 9. Mr. Ward?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
I muted him, Scott, so.
No, I'm here.
Did you want to finish responding to Mr. Reinhardt's question? I'm not sure you finished because we got the feedback.
Yeah, no problem. No, I meant properties with fill or retaining walls, or there's a couple that are actually built into a wall on the levee. Are there any provisions made for that?
So the retaining walls would need to have an encroachment permit from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and they would need to be built within Title 23 standards. I'm not aware of whether the retaining walls out there are permitted or not. That's not something we're focused on right now. That would be a secondary issue that Kevin mentioned will be followed up in the future to make sure that those walls have permits. For the properties with fill, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board has a variance process. The variance, I don't believe, would apply to access and visibility, but it would apply to meeting the other standards that RD 1000 isn't currently pursuing addressing in the O&M manual. So the other vegetation standards that are in zones 3 and 4, a property owner could apply for a variance, would be my expectation. Annalise, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that you want to provide.
I think you covered it, Rick. I mean, the board evaluates a request based on the current standards. If the current standards are not met, then a variance could be requested. So there is a process by which someone can request a variance. Those are difficult and I think hard to come by. There's a very specific requirements that've got to be met for those variances to be appealing to the board for the consideration. So in general, those are not an option. So typically it's just compliance with the current standards as they exist for anything that is to occur within the levee.
Mr. Ward, does that answer your question?
Sorry, the very end of that actually broke up, but that might be my internet.
I'll try to repeat that. So the any work that occurs on the levee just has to meet the current standards for the specific work. So whether it's a retaining wall, whether it's fill, there's specific requirements that've got to be met. If those requirements can't be met for different reasons, then the variance process is one that can be made, but that often is not one that is looked favorable by our board and that is often granted.
Okay, thank you. And you're Central Valley, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you. I do believe there's a couple in the chat though.
I do have a
Yeah,
question.
so I just pulled up the chat. So from Bambi, how do I know if my shrubs, et cetera, are permitted? How far back do the records at RD 1000 go to show permits? So RD 1000 does have and has maintained files for every APN. So Bambi, I could pull up tomorrow morning when I'm in the office your specific APN to show you a copy of all the files that we have in our records. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board has a more complete record, and so that would be something that I could work with Annalise on to provide that to you to show what's been permitted and what's not. I can assure you that all of the properties that I've personally reviewed and Annalise has reviewed since we started this notification back in January, we have not seen through that, not random, but the request for more information, we have not seen one single permit for landscape that's subject to this modification project that we're proposing and offering the funding to do. We haven't seen one permitted landscape permit. And so all of the landscape vegetation that's been installed as an encroachment has been unpermitted. Now there could be some outliers, but we haven't come across one yet for those that have reached out. And so Rita, I do have another message from you directly to me. Feel free to send me an email and I would be happy to meet with you tomorrow, myself or Gabe or both of us to walk through your question there in the chat. And so, I'll be in the office at 6:30 tomorrow morning. And so happy to meet with you or schedule a call tomorrow morning. So Rita, please reach out to me. I do have probably the best resource here is to email the Swift account or reach out to me directly. My email address is kking, Kevin, first initial King, King, at rd1000.org.
Hey, Kevin, while we're waiting for other questions, I wonder if it wouldn't be worth going back to the narrative slide that says what our contractors are, because I know there was many questions from the association and the association's council about exactly what work we're proposing to do. And I just want to make sure we hit that very clearly for everybody, since council had emailed me twice asking for clarity on that.
Scott, I think this is the slide you're referring to.
That's correct. And I
So if
think
you
I
want to go ahead and speak to that, Scott, go ahead.
I have a question, please.
Well, I feel like I didn't get an answer to my question. I had a follow-up question also, Bambi Rethford.
All right, Bambi.
Thank you. I've lived here for 24 years, and you say you have all these records going back for 24 years, but in the 24 years I've lived here, I haven't had any information about I have to be permitted for this shrub or to do this tree. So how much information prior to the previous owners to my property did they have, knowing that they had to apply for this, to plant anything here? And so I just feel like now to go back and you might have records that show nothing because nobody had any information that they had to even do this.
Yeah, Bambi, if I could address that for you. In fact, we got a call today, and something that coordination between and amongst agencies is severely lacking. We had a call today from a property owner that has been issued a building permit on a Riverside property to do some expansion work to their residence.
That happens. That is my husband. Thank you.
Everything seems to be in place. They think they're ready to go. And then they find out, after working through the building department and issued a permit, that now they have to get a permit from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board with RD1000's endorsement of that permit. Typically, RD1000 can turn around the endorsement of the permit. So we review and give you guys kind of a heads up about things that we think may not be compliant with Title 23. We can typically do that within a month's time frame. Some take longer, but the Central Valley Flood Protection Board in their permit review takes upwards of about 18 months. And so you can imagine the frustration, and I certainly, again, sympathize with all of you, that process takes a long time. And so we're currently, again, evaluating. The city of Sacramento does they have a system in place that notifies us when any permits are in, so we can review very early on when permit applications are submitted. The county is a little bit lacking in their ability to provide that notification, but again, we get it after the fact. We can't.
Yeah, we were told it was a glitch.
Yeah, well,
a year into the process, it's a glitch.
Yeah, so as soon as we get them, we process them. Also, in property acquisition through title and disclosures, the expectation is that RD1000, our expectation is that you're notified of what it means when you purchase a property on the Riverside of the Sacramento River system, is that you're kind of notified and full disclosures are out there through the title company or whatever. The real estate transaction should have these disclosures. There's also the responsibility of the new property owner to register the existing permits in the new ownership name with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. So you essentially file for a name change with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to place the permit in your name. And so I certainly understand, and I've talked to numerous property owners on the Riverside along Garden Highway in the last 2.5 years since I became the general manager, and I appreciate and understand your frustration. I can also tell you that I'm working in a working group right now to revise the encroachment permit process and to streamline the encroachment permit process through Title 23. And so that's another project that I'm continuing to work on and advocating on behalf of you as our constituent base, but also as the district, to streamline this process to help out in the expedition of these permits. So absolutely understand, but it should be disclosed at the minimum in the title report.
Patrick Tully, I have a question or a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
So Patrick Tully from Garden Highway Community Association. We represent about 280 homeowners on the water side, as you know, Kevin, but so everybody else knows. A couple of questions. Driving the road last couple of days, I noticed that there were a few lots that appeared like there'd been landscape work done all the way down to the river. Was that your crews?
Do you have the specific property address? I did notice, I drove out there today, I did notice some other work going on, but we've only hit a handful of properties this week as we're getting going here. So if you have those addresses, I can't speak to whether that was us or not, unless I have the address or APN.
I mean, yeah, I can get you the address, but I mean, are the crews, would they be going past the 10 feet? Because these crews cleared like low-level landscape all the way down to the water. I mean, is that a possibility that your crew would do that?
I think the thing that would make the most sense is if you could provide an approximate location or an address, and we can answer definitively whether our crew did it, because it's certainly not consistent with what we're describing to you. But I don't think that Mr. King can tell you about something he's not familiar with until you identify what the property is.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate legal jumping in, but these are real questions that if there's crews clearing vegetation on Garden Highway, there better be some level of restrictions and understanding as to what they're doing and what they're not doing. So that concerns me greatly. The last meeting, I also asked a question that I thought was very important at the time, was whether trees were going to be removed. And I actually never got an answer to that. It was more of a certain size, but there was no definitive answer on that. Have we focused in on whether trees, even if they're small, let's say valley oaks, because these are real environmental concerns. We have nesting Swainson hawks between 10 and 20 on Garden Highway. So kind of want to understand the impact, whether it be noise or vegetation clearing that's occurring. Maybe you could speak towards that.
Yeah, Mr. Tully, I can assure you that tree removal in this portion for the landscape modification is not included. You're referencing our second schedule should we have remaining funds available through the FMAP grant after we go through the landscape modification stuff. That we certainly don't want to turn the funds back over to the state and take advantage, because we do have other issues that trees under a certain diameter would be removed. We do have and will perform a biological survey for all endangered species when we get to that portion, whether it's Swainson's hawk or vegetation, native vegetation or threatened vegetation. We did receive correspondence from the Sierra Club. We provided back a response to the Sierra Club in that regard, but we are currently limbing up to maintain the trees to visibility standards and not removing any trees through this this initial work here. And so I respect your concern here. We feel that we're completely compliant with all of the environmental conditions in CEQA and notifications. And so our project is, particularly for the landscape modification portion, does not include tree removal. Our operation manager, Gabe Holloman, is meeting on site with our contractor every morning and reviewing the extent of the modification to ensure that the crews on site understand the extent of the work that they're performing for that day.
So there won't be any trimming of valley oak trees then? Hello?
Yes, I would ask you to be more specific with your question. If there is a 1 foot tall valley oak that is under a hedge within 3 feet of the road, if think it's going to be removed because we have an obligation to remove everything within 3 feet of the road.
Well, let's say
About an established Valley Oak that's 20 feet onto the property, that's not part of this project.
okay, so we got a 20 Valley Oak that's 20 feet into the property. It easily reaches 20 feet back to the crown of the levee and hangs down. So it's within the 8-foot limit. Are you going to trim that Valley Oak?
All the trees have to be trimmed up to provide, yeah, all the trees have to be trimmed up to provide visibility. And there's a vertical requirement that they're trimmed to.
Okay. All right, my next question, I promise I have this one and maybe a follow-up to it. And I know that all the members appreciate, because they've all heard from me and we've talked a lot about this. I'm looking at right in front of me is the Army Corps vegetation variance that you mentioned. And I've also spoken to the Army Corps about this very thing. And in the variance itself, talking about the Natomas Levee Improvement Project, it's the vegetation standards, but may allow vegetation to remain if these projects can demonstrate that the public safety risks posed to levee integrity have been adequately addressed and engineered into project designs. So when I spoke with the Army Corps of Engineers, they specifically said that the design of the adjacent levee does not call for removal of waterside vegetation. What do you say about that?
You'd have to give us the name of the person you talked to so we could follow up to make sure we understand what they communicated to you.
Okay, I'll be happy to provide that. But what do you say about the variance?
For the benefit of the other property owners on the call tonight, in the meeting tonight, our understanding.
With all due respect, I represent 280 property owners. You issued warnings to 100 of them, almost 50%. You can give me the courtesy to allow for having a discussion on important issues. I'm well versed in all these issues, as you know that. I'm really not liking how you cut me off in every one of these meetings. These are real questions from real people that I help represent.
Yeah, Mr. Tully, I can appreciate that. I apologize if you feel you've been cut off. I was cut off in a phone call that I made to you at 8 p.m. On Thursday night last week, and because your dinner arrived, you hung up on me. So thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Tully, and we'll continue to work forward.
Okay,
no, you have been cutting him off, and you also are not answering his questions, and he does represent us. You need to be accountable for that. You did not answer whether or not you were cutting down to the water line on those properties. You could answer that if you've done that on any properties. So you are being very evasive in your answering of questions, and you are not letting him represent us.
So, sir, I don't know what your name is. I see the initials RG. This is Scott Shapiro. I'm one of the district's counsel, and I'm really regret that it's coming across as us doing our best not to answer questions. That's not what's going at all. I know I heard Mr. King say that that was not the direction given to a crew. Mr. Tully asked whether particular properties had been cut by our crew down to the water. Mr. King was not there to see exactly what's being talked about, and Mr. Tully has not identified the particular properties. But if in follow-up to this, you would like to and would submit an email identifying the properties, we will respond in less than 24 hours with confirmation that it wasn't our crew or that there's something else going on that we don't know. So it's not that we're trying to avoid answering the questions, it's that we might need some more facts in order to answer them. I do see that Mr. Ward put another question in the chat, which goes to this future enforcement that Mr. King mentioned, and I want to make sure we get to that. And I see that Ms. Olson put a series of comments in as well, which I think were answered by Mr. King's presentation, but it may be valuable for Mr. Reinhardt to run through them again, just to make sure everyone is understanding what we're trying to communicate. And then Mr. Tully, it sounds like you may still have additional questions. So what's your preference on the order we go through this?
Well, yeah, I have one follow-up to the presentation. I mean, I'm sorry, and I apologize to all our members. I thought this was going to be a discussion. The PowerPoint we've seen multiple times. I probably could give out the PowerPoint. I do like the addition of my property on there with my patinas that have existed for over 20 years being butchered. But I mean, it's great to see my own house in there. But I have a particular issue with, early in the presentation, you say that the vegetation was part of the reason that the levee was uncertified. You don't mention that we got a new levee. The new levee was built in response to the decertification. So the SWIFT framework is really intended for rehabilitation of an old levee. And now we got a new one. So I think, in all fairness, we really have to be looking at the fact that there's a new levee here. The Army Corps clearly says that the levee can be designed to a standard that the vegetation is not an issue. And you have further said you're acting on stuff that they haven't actually released yet. You literally said they closed the book on a chapter. You know, I'm actually a little bit stunned that you guys go forward on this stuff with so much stuff up in the air. So I don't know if there's a question to the statement, but I'll back out and let somebody else ask. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Tully, so as stated previously, the current operations and maintenance manual does not include a vegetative variance from the Corps. Rick previously explained that the design of the new levee features incorporated the existing levee, and it's all one feature from a design standpoint. And so I think those items have been addressed. And this is literally what we're trying to communicate tonight. Because we've received opt-outs from various property owners, is that the next steps here, it's either opt-in, take advantage of the funding that's available, or go down the enforcement path with the state and feds. And so
you've said that multiple times. I mean, the issue here is that the variance that I directly quoted from is August of 2010. This is not a new document.
Mr. Tully, you're selectively quoting from it. The Corps' approval is very clear that the adjacent levee allows for the vegetation variance so long as access and visibility is maintained. That's very clear in the Corps' approval.
I'm literally reading it. It doesn't say anything about visibility in that section. So, I mean, the point here is that you're taking actions which are really detrimental to the environment and people's private properties.
Mr. Tully, we're not taking any action. We're not taking any actions. The district is offering the opportunity for people to elect to have the district trim back landscaping so that you will be in compliance with what we expect the rules to be. You have the ability to opt out, to make the decision that you believe your interpretation of the veg variance is the correct interpretation. And if it is, you're good. And if it isn't, then the procedure that Mr. King indicated is going to be the procedure, not by RD 1000. We're not the enforcement authority right now. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board is. So I just want to be careful that when you say, you know, we're imposing, we're taking these actions, we are trying to be the helpful government agency that says, here is an opportunity. You have the right to opt out. Everyone on this call opted out. If you wish to stay opted out, that is your right. We just don't want the time to pass without you understanding the framework. You can disagree with it, but I'm not an engineer and you're not an engineer. Maybe you are, but the certifying engineer is on the call telling you this is the interpretation, this is the interpretation by the state, this is the interpretation by the Corps. You can choose to disagree. It is your right.
Well, okay, so I'd like to respond to that. With all due respect, you might say it's an option out, but we've just spent the last hour and 20 minutes, we've heard Kevin 3 times essentially threaten us. And so you can say that you're not an enforcement agency, but at the same time, he said, we will turn the names over. That's a threat, and that's you guys doing it. So with all due respect, what you just said is not true. It's just not factual. So you have an obligation, if there's a window of that the Army Corps is not done with these standards, and the Army Corps has designed the new levee to withhold any vegetation issues, you have an obligation to make sure that you've checked that out completely. And quite honestly, I don't think you have. And quite honestly, I don't think you know what is going on as far as vegetation removal. Because I wasn't asking about any property. My particular property has very old oaks that hang over the property. They don't meet the current spec. You would want to remove them. You'd want to cut them. But all due respect, we've had a lot of threatening talk tonight, very little discussion. So I'll back out because I know other people want to ask questions, but this has not been a discussion. This has been another PowerPoint.
And Mr. Shapiro and Mr. King, I'm wondering if I may just quickly interject. My name is Caitlin Haar. I'm an attorney working with Mr. Tolley and the Garden Highway Community Association. And previously, with Mr. Shapiro and Ms. Smith, we had talked about kind of the possibility of an opt-out pending an opportunity to collaborate with the Reclamation District and figure out what exactly the plan is on, perhaps even a homeowner by homeowner basis. And we were invited here, as the homeowners who opted out to have a discussion and collaboration. So thank you again for making the time and letting us be heard. And another question that I did see, I believe Mr. Ward raised in the chat was whether, environmental review either has been done or will be done for another phase of this. So I'm wondering if perhaps we can address both the kind of Goldilocks opt-out and how we could potentially collaborate, and then also the environmental review aspect.
Sure. So let me do my best with both of those and ask Kevin and Rick and Rebecca Smith to join in if I miss something. So on the issue of the opt-out, we were clear with you, and we've been clear in our communications with the property owners that they can opt out, and that is why we're having this meeting. The purpose of tonight is to provide more education along the lines you mentioned, Ms. Haar, about seeing if we can collaborate. In particular, while Mr. Tully was critical of the PowerPoint, it did include a number of new slides. It included a very clear textual recitation of the work that will be done, which we understood was not clear before, and we wanted to communicate that. It also included some before and after images of an actual property that was trimmed yesterday, so we could show an example of what it looked like, because there was lack of clarity about that. And as we talked about, collaborating is more achievable when people know what the work will be. And we felt both of those slides would help with that. In addition, the slide that Mr. Tully referenced, which showed a before and after, was designed to help with that. So all of those were designed to educate so that people would be in a better position to evaluate whether they might want to opt in the future. I heard Mr. King make multiple offers on this call, including one to a woman who messaged him that he will meet with anybody, or Gabe will meet with anyone to go over specifics, and that offer remains. I do think we have some practical limitations, which is in order for the crew to come in and do clearing, they need to do road closures, they need to get permission from the city or the county to shut roads, and therefore it's done in segments because you have to have flags and cones, etc. And so it could be that there might be a house or two, which if it doesn't collaborate quickly enough, they can't get back to. But if they can collaborate and it fits as part of the schedule, that opportunity still remains. So before we go to environmental clearance, let me ask Kevin. Kevin, did I correctly capture your intention and the process by which people can continue to communicate with the district and you and try to collaborate to a solution?
Yes, thank you, Scott.
Okay, and Rick, anything you want to add on that particular issue? Okay, so on the environmental issue that you asked, the district does process a notice of exemption for routine O&M. That notice of exemption this year was filed with both the Sacramento County as well as Sutter County. It has been filed and it has been accepted and it is in operation, and it is the basis for our routine O&M. It is the district's continuing belief that trimming along the road, which by the way needs to happen for other reasons as well, and down to the 10-foot level is within routine O&M. It does not, in our mind, trigger any other special environmental protections. Mr. King and his crew have been in constant communication with California Department of Wildlife, Fish and Wildlife. We even went so far as to CC them on our letter back to the Sierra Club to make absolutely clear and keep them informed on what's going on. So we're not doing anything in an opaque way. We're trying to be very transparent. And our clear communication to them of the work that we will be doing has not garnered any particular concerns. There was a question in the chat, I believe, for Mr. Ward about the next phase and would an EIR be done and what the environmental compliance would be done on it. And of course, the next phase isn't clear. We don't know what that would be, when it would be, what properties, what actions would be taken. So it's not defined enough at this point to actually do any sort of environmental document, but it is clear that whatever we do would need to comply not only with the Endangered Species, California Endangered Species Act, potentially the U.S. Endangered Species Act, California Environmental Quality Act. And so just as we are complying with those now, we would comply with them in the future. And that those actions would be part of a public and transparent process whereby we ensure that we have proper coverage for any actions we're taking. So let me ask Rebecca Smith in particular on that last one as co-district counsel, whether she wants to add anything on that.
Can I add something real? Can I just add something real quick? So being very familiar with special districts, I'm just curious, since you are a public entity and you kind of are required to tell us if we ask what's on the table, do you have any inkling of what the next stage is?
So let me ask Rebecca to answer the previous question just about whether there's anything she wanted to add on coverage, and then Mr. Ward, I promise I'll come back and we'll see if we can.
Okay, thank you. Cool.
Yeah,
thanks.
you know, Scott, I would just offer, we've talked a lot about the opt-out concept, and I want to be clear because sometimes I think it's easy to get confused. There are a lot of regulatory agencies here. RD 1000, when we say you can opt out, the only thing we really have the power to do to let you opt out of, to say you can opt out of, is to opt out of this program of RD 1000 paying for the removals. You certainly can choose not to participate in that, but you know, as I think Kevin and Rick have indicated, we don't have the ability to say, hey folks, you don't, you know, these rules that are being imposed by other regulatory agencies don't apply to you. You know, and if you were to go forward and say, all right, well, I want to go engage with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board on this, you certainly can, but that's out of our hands. And so sometimes I think, you know, myself, Scott, Rick, you know, a lot of the flood folks have a pretty good sense of where we've seen things like this go in the past and what the flood world looks like. And I think, you know, there's been an effort to say, hey guys, this is what we expect to happen. But at the end of the day, you know, we don't have control over that next regulatory step. And so I want to be clear when we say opt out, you know, we can't offer you an opt out of a rule that is being imposed by the Corps, for example.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I'll let Scott get back to coverage.
Thank you, Rebecca. And if I may just quickly, I appreciate, thank you for the explanation, both Scott and Rebecca and Kevin, Mr. King. And I think that's why our particular interest, we understand that there are lots of regulatory agencies at play here, and the particular interest was seeing how we can collaborate now, you know, knowing that there is kind of a clock, particularly on the funding element of this, but collaborate on that just, we need more info. There's people that do want more information before they go ahead and opt in. So that, I mean, in past conversations, that seemed like it was definitely something within RD 1000's kind of control. And so just to make clear, if someone is still in that position and they've opted out because they want more information, should they contact Mr. King to make sure they're initiating that perhaps site visit, or just want to make sure I'm clear on what the recommended course of action is there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, please contact me as soon as possible, and we'll arrange for a site visit and provide more information. The contractor does have a schedule. There are, as Scott mentioned earlier, traffic control plans and, you know, arrangements. And so if the property owner delays in any of that, you know, process, to the extent that we have the ability to come back and we haven't extended all the funds when we have an opportunity to come back, if we skip them now, I can't assure that we would have the funding available for the property owner, say in August or September, because we're going to expend those funds. There may be an opportunity in September timeframe before we go out to the second schedule if there's any remaining funds. So those that opted out, if they still need more information, I would love to work with the subset of that group to see if we can get the contractor to come back out and address those ones and twos, but I can't guarantee funding will still be available.
Thank you, and I'll defer to the other homeowners now to let them answer their questions, but I just wanted to make sure that those things were clear. Thanks, I appreciate the explanation.
Thank you, Kate. Let me make sure that Mr. Ward's question gets answered, and then I see others showing up as well. Rick, did you want to jump in on something that Caitlin said?
Yeah, Kevin, do you have the ability to allow me to share my screen?
Yes, I'll make you the presenter now. I think Rick, you'll have to accept that.
Okay.
Rick, we were seeing it and it just went away.
Can you try one more? Oh, I got it. Here it is. So this is to Mr. Tully's point. Can you see the text on the screen?
We see 8.3.
So this is actually from the vegetation variance. This describes the requirements that must be met once the project is complete. And it says, managing the vegetation on the waterside slope of the Sacramento River East Levee and conducting other necessary maintenance, monitoring, flood fighting responsibilities presents particular challenges because of the residential development that has been allowed on the waterside of the levee. To carry out these responsibilities on a long-term basis, RD 1000 Central Valley Flood Protection Board personnel must be able to inspect the waterside slope of the levee from the Garden Highway. This will require that existing hedges and other vegetation that presently prevent roadside visibility of the slope be appropriately trimmed or otherwise relocated or removed. And so I just wanted to respond to Mr. Tully's point that the vegetation variance doesn't require this. It very clearly requires it. This is section 8.3 of the variance request. And I believe, Kevin, this is available on your website if folks want to review this language themselves.
Thank you, Rick. So let me, I don't know how I suddenly became the MC, but since I seem to have taken that role, let me see if I can't get us through some more of these questions. Mr. Tully had asked the question about, do we have an inkling of what might be required in the future? And just as a reminder, the reason these are on the list is they are the highest hazard encroachments that have been identified, and that is why we're focusing on them. I don't know if either Rick or Kevin can speak to the future or whether the future is literally so uncertain at this point that we're just not there.
Well, the SWIP hasn't been approved. And so the high hazard is to address the items on the inspection reports that Kevin showed from the Corps and from DWR and the board, but also for FEMA certification and for the state's 200-year finding that allows development to continue after 2025. Once the Corps' approach and the board's approach is a worst first. These 100 are the high hazard. They are the worst. And then we'll need to come forward with a plan to address the rest of the, Kevin said a total of 600 and something encroachments earlier, but that plan hasn't been developed on what that looks like yet.
Another question that was asked was, I think we answered the one about whether the future EIR. I see Mr. Tully has put a question in the chat saying Title 23 allows grandfathering of vegetation or structures in place. Before Title 23 was made, why we've not mentioned that? I just want to remind everyone, we're not enforcing the standards against you. We are offering an opportunity for the district to clear some of the vegetation to be in compliance with the standards. Even if Title 23 did allow that, I'm not offering an opinion whether it does, Annalise may choose to, there are still separate standards from the Army Corps of Engineers that are applicable here, and Rick just read them from section 8.3 of the vegetation variance. And so even if that was the case, then you would still have an issue. Another question was, when was Title 23 created? And I don't know, other than that I do know it was in existence at latest in the 50s, and I think may have gone back to the creation of the Reclamation Board in 1926. But different provisions have been amended over different times, and I think Annalise provided a hyperlink to the regs, and the information may be there as well. Bambi has asked that we answer Christine Olson's questions. I will note that some of them are more statements than questions, and I feel like we have addressed them in the PowerPoint, but let me just go through them one by one to make sure that people understand we are doing our best to be responsive here. She writes, a couple of months ago, USACE told the association in writing that the new levee, the Garden Highway Waterside Levee, is now outside the levee prism. So federal regulations no longer apply. Sorry, the chat just shifted and I lost it. Here it is. USACE said no one should be telling you to remove your waterside vegetation. And I did hear from Ms. Haar as well as Ms. Beecher at Chronic that there was an email that said that. We've asked for a copy of it and we have not received it yet, so it's a little hard to respond to it. I do know that the name that was identified as the person who sent it is in the Public Affairs Office at the Army Corps of Engineers. And in talking with the operations person at the Corps, they were unaware of it having been sent or the context in which it was sent. And I think Mr. Reinhardt's recitation from 8.3 also demonstrates that the very document that the Corps is processing is completely inconsistent with this email. So Rick, I don't know if you have anything to add to that point.
We just asked for, who the person was so we could follow up and make sure that what was communicated is being portrayed accurately or is out of context, or if maybe they weren't in communication with their operations division who is setting these standards for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and RD 1000.
The next question from Ms. Olson, again, a statement. The regulations for access and visibility relate to visibility of the levee slope. There is no regulation that requires visibility on properties with fill where the levee slope is not visible. It's more of an assertion that there is no regulation. I think we've heard from Mr. Reinhardt in reading that that's not the case. Anything, Rick, you have to add on that?
No, that's where we talked about that the O&M manual from the Corps and the vegetation variance doesn't acknowledge or doesn't make a difference between properties that have fill and don't have fill. And we believe the solution is to work with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to get a variance from the vegetation requirements. But that really applies to the next step in or the things we're not talking about today. It doesn't apply to high hazard. If you've got vegetation that blocks access and visibility, it doesn't matter whether there's fill or not. The same standard's applicable.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Also, Ms. Olson writes, by congressional act in 2014, levee vegetation removal is not, every time someone puts a question, it shifts, is not required for support under Public Law 8499. Again, Rick, I don't know if you're the one to answer that or.
Well, it's not required to maintain eligibility. It does have to be addressed in the SWIFT process, and it does have to be addressed for both FEMA certification so that Natomas gets mapped out of the 100-year floodplain. There's not mandatory insurance, and it does need to be addressed so that an urban level of flood protection finding can be made and development can continue in the Natomas Basin. The high hazard has to be addressed for those two things to occur.
Okay, and then she also writes that the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's policy, I appreciate all your questions, but every time you type one, it shifts. Policy of enforcement is worst first. With a new levy, we are not worst. It sounds like you're threatening us. I regret that it sounds like we're threatening you. We're really trying to educate you on what your options are here and what happens if you choose different paths. The board, I guess, could choose not to enforce on these issues in the short term if there are more serious issues in the board's mind. But I do know that failure to deal with these issues by 2025 will result in an inability to provide the proper certification under both FEMA as well as the ULDC, which not only means the loss of future development within Natomas, which may not be an issue for any of you, but it would result in an inability to remap the Natomas Basin out of the FEMA floodplain, which would result in the continuation of higher cost mandatory flood insurance for anybody whose finished floor elevation is below the base flood elevation. I see a question from Mr. Ward here. There are numerous properties on Garden Highway that are owned by the state or county. What does the vegetation removal compliance look like for those parcels? And I guess I would ask if either Rick or Kevin know whether any of those parcels were the 100 or so that have been identified as the highest risk. So
My,
sounds like
my familiarity with the city and county and state properties is that I'm not aware of any of those being in the high hazard 100 properties we're talking about.
But I will say that, Mr. Ward, if there is a particular property that you're interested in understanding, just as the previous question for Mr. Tully about properties that he said he saw a vegetation clearance on, you can submit an APN or an address and we can get back to you with a specific answer to your question. Mr. Tully writes, which was, oh, this is the, sorry, this is a continuation of the grandfathering point. Let me just read it all together because I don't want to inadvertently misrepresent what Mr. Tully is saying. He writes, Title 23 allowed grandfathering of vegetation or structures in place before Title 23 was made. Why have you not mentioned this, which was prior to the design of the new levee? The new levee has it built into the design. And I think Mr. Reinhardt has explained that, yes, there are aspects of existing situations that are built into the design of the levee, but those do have limits. And the limit here is one of visibility and accessibility as read in the section that Mr. Reinhardt quoted. Yes, that is a version of the document, which you may argue that I'm sorry, Mr. Tully, go ahead. If you can clarify, please do.
Yeah, because sorry, the chat is a little bit cumbersome for discussion because there were two different topics there. One was the Title 23 and the ability to clearly allow grandfathering of stuff. The other sentence I said was in response to Rick talking about the encroachment standard from 2010. The encroachment standard for 2010, the variant, sorry, I apologize. The variance from 2010 was created before the adjacent levee. And the variance clearly says if the design of the levee is made to handle everything on the other side, then that could be dealt with, right? So yes, the 2010 says that, but it has built into it the idea that an engineer could design a levee in a way that the inside vegetation is no longer important. And that is essentially what the Army Corps has told me. And you are correct. It was the chief of the PIO. And he specifically went to his engineers, and that was the response that came back.
So, Mr. Tully, I think you misunderstood the relationship of the variance. The variance was approved in combination with the design of the adjacent levee. It fully anticipated what was going to be built, and it specifically cites, because we were in construction at the time on portions of the adjacent levee, and they said if it's built per the plans that have been approved, then this vegetation variance is granted so long as access and visibility is achieved. I'd encourage you to read not just the approval letters, but the vegetation variance itself from cover to cover, because I think you've got a misunderstanding of what was presented to the Corps for approval and what the Corps ultimately approved.
I don't know if you can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can hear you. Yeah,
sorry, my video locked up or something. Yeah, you guys often say that we don't understand, and I would like to tell you that we understand a lot of stuff. We just see it as a different perspective than you, okay? And that's our right to be able to do that. And I appreciate that you're an engineer and you're an expert in this area. But again, your SWIFT isn't approved. there's a lot of stuff that's still up in the air. I'm quite shocked that you take action when a lot of this stuff is not actually feet on the ground yet. It hasn't landed. And so, you know, when the Army Corps tells me that the design does not call for vegetation removal, when the very top guy with PIO, yeah, he's PIO, and he went to the engineer and said that, then I take note. And I find it very interesting. I appreciate you have your perspective, but my perspective is different. And I think it's going to be the same a lot of people are going to have.
Mr. Tully, I appreciate you. Oh, go ahead, Rick. You go first, please.
Well, I just said to be clear, I mean, I didn't make this point earlier, but I was on the team that worked on the vegetation variance. And so I've worked on this program since 2002. And so I've been through the entire process. I'm very familiar. I'm talking about issues of fact, not perception or perspective. It's a fact that the Army Corps of Engineers approved the vegetation variance with the adjacent levee design. It's a fact that the Corps requires access and visibility. Those aren't debatable issues.
Okay, and it is also a fact that the Army Corps told me that the design of the new levee doesn't call for any waterside vegetation removal. That is also a fact.
We understand that you've been given some misinformation through the PIO, or that what he said has been taken out of context. If you provide the name of the individual you talk to, we will talk to the chief of operations and we'll have them follow back up. I think the email would be helpful, so we saw exactly what was communicated to you in writing, so that we can have that formally followed up on if it wasn't accurately conveyed to you.
It was the PIO chief. Yeah, we're happy to share that.
Yeah, so Mr. Tully, we did ask for a copy of that email several weeks ago. We have not received it yet. If you can send it over to Mr. King, would be fine. We would be happy to engage in an email conversation with the Corps, and you can even be on it, in which we get clarity on that issue for you. And I just want to come back to the context for this conversation. I don't want to invalidate your frustration. I hear it. I understand it. If I was in your shoes, I'd be frustrated too. What I want to do is make sure that people don't feel that something is being imposed upon you. If you believe that your interpretation is more correct than ours, then don't participate in the opt-in. If you have questions and you want to further understand and you want us to do the follow-up with the Corps and get the answers for you, excellent. You'll have more information and you can make a decision yourself. If you are satisfied as a result of the meeting tonight that we have been able to give you information that demonstrates either a wrong understanding or that shows there is a risk to what you currently have, then that's your decision as well. We're not threatening. We created an opportunity to use state funds to try to help. And it's actually challenging to be part of the Reclamation District team and to be accused of imposing and having no due process when this program was intended to help. And if you don't want to participate, you have opted out, you need to communicate no further. I want to make sure we're capturing all the questions that are in the.
Well, let me just respond to that. With all due respect, remember, I'm the president of the Garden Highway Community Association. So this isn't just about me. This is about 280 people who live on Garden Highway, who've lived there for a long time. That have been, some houses have been there for a long time and never had any vegetation failures of a levee. So this isn't just about me. So you mentioned it was me. It's not me. I'm out for everybody's interest.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't recall mentioning.
So let me just step in here real quick. We understand that you're the president of the Garden Highway Community Association. We've responded repeatedly and asked specifically to meet with your association. I sent out a request to meet at your next available board meeting. That was, my request was declined, Mr. Tully.
Yeah. And why don't you tell us,
please, I'm going to mute you because I want to make a point. Mr. Tully, so I have repeatedly reached out to Mr. Tully as the representative. The opt-out letters and form letters that we've received back into my inbox said to continue to work with the Garden Highway Community Association, which I've repeatedly attempted to do through the representatives. However, the Garden Highway Community Association wasn't made the legal representative for individual property owners. And I think that Scott and Rebecca have both communicated that to the legal counsel that's been retained by the Garden Highway Community Association, and a misconception that we need to work through them and not with them. We're continuing to work with the Garden Highway Community Association, but I want everyone on the call tonight that's opted out as an individual property owner to understand what's being said on your behalf and the perspective that we see. This isn't adversarial from the district to the Garden Highway property owners. This is literally offering assistance to come into compliance with enforcement action that may be necessary down the road between Central Valley Flood Protection Board or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I apologize if this is a threat, but RD1000 as the local maintaining agency has the obligation when we notice violations of Title 23 to provide the property owner a notice of violation and copy the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. These items have been noted repeatedly in the spring and fall levee inspection reports performed by the state. And so now we need to address it. We're on a tight time frame. We're making the funding available. So we literally set this meeting up tonight for those that have opted out to hear directly from us, our perspective. You have the full right to continue to opt out. If you wish to change your position and opt back in, please notify me as soon as possible, and we'll do our best to accommodate you to take advantage of the funding that we have for this summer. So,
Kevin, if I may, too, just a reminder, you know, we appreciate the role that the association is playing in organizing folks and disseminating information. From my chair as a district attorney, though, I'm gonna want to be really clear. When the district is looking for a decision about whether or not they should come onto your property and do work, they need to be able to interact with the landowner. It's great to be able to disseminate information, but you know, to those landowners who are on the call, we're really relying on you as a landowner to say yay or nay to this effort. We can't delegate that to a third party and hope to understand or risk some miscommunication. And so if you're an individual landowner saying I want to opt out or I don't, that's fine either way. You know, we've discussed this and run circles around this quite a bit, but we do need to actually have, you know, we're looking to a landowner to make that decision. You know, to protect the district's own liabilities, so that we can be very, very clear that when we do work on the behalf of the landowner, or if an individual landowner ends up having to deal with the flood board, that we have engaged with that individual and everybody's on the same page about it.
So I'm going to thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to go back to the chat because I know there are things we haven't addressed there, and I want to be sensitive to people not feeling as though we're avoiding answering questions. Mr. Ward, you have in here asking if you can re-ask a question. I don't know if that was before you re-asked it or whether you have another one.
No, same original question. We sort of spiraled somewhere different. I was curious, as a special district, which I believe you're obligated to inform us, do you have any indication, you as an RD1000, of what is to come next? Stage 2, stage 3, as far as the Corps is concerned, SAFCA is concerned, Central Valley Flood Control is concerned, any entity, do you have any indication of what is possible next as far as past vegetation removal on those first 10 feet?
So I'm going to ask if Rick wants to take that, but Rick, I need to modify Mr. Ward's question a little bit because Mr. Ward, you said any inkling, you almost used the word speculation, and I don't want to go down that road. I'd like, Rick, if you could provide.
Sorry, I didn't mean speculatory. I meant, as a special district, have you received communication from RD1000 or other, sorry, not from RD1000, from anybody else as RD1000, that there is a stage 2, 3, 4, and what that might entail past that 10 feet from the fog line?
Thank you. That's a helpful,
simple question.
Yeah,
sorry.
Very helpful. So Rick, what communications have you received from the Corps or the board that are helpful here in understanding the future.
Kevin, can you put up the slide that shows the cross section with the zones?
Yeah, give me 1 second here.
So while he's doing that, Mr. Ward, we're addressing the high hazard portion of the vegetation compliance.
No, I understand that. I think I completely understand this phase. I'm merely asking questions for the future. I'm
Right,
thinking
that's
long term here.
That's where I'm going.
Okay.
So the part 3 of the O&M manual that the Corps is circulating for approval lays out what full compliance looks like, and it's more than high hazard. And so we're talking about wave zone 1 and 2 and coming into compliance with wave zone 1 and 2. But there's more vegetation, more landscaping management needed to ultimately comply with what's demonstrated on this graphic. And so that's what's going to happen in the future. And what Kevin had said earlier, there isn't a plan for how that's going to happen or when that's going to happen, whether that's 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. That is the next step when working with the Corps. Once the SWIFT is approved, the most immediate focus is on these high hazard ones, but want to be very clear that this is what part 3 of the O&M manual ultimately says is going to be required beyond those high hazard vegetation landscaping encroachments.
Ward, is there any sort of clarification?
That's not a very happy outlook for those of us that live here. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, and Mr. Ward, I can appreciate that sentiment. RD 1000 can't predict what happens down the road. All of the, whether they're grandfathered or have developed over time along the Sacramento River East Side Levee, all of the encroachments and improvements that have been performed to date, again, are under the subject of permits. And so we don't have an indication or assurances that those permits would not be revoked in the future. I certainly understand your concern in that regard. What our obligation is to do is develop a plan to address various encroachment issues to maintain compliance with the O&M manual and Title 23. To the extent that permitted structures have been allowed, I think that there's a compelling case, so long as we can demonstrate that it doesn't impact the performance of the levee system or RD 1000 as a local maintaining agency to adhere to our obligation. So I certainly understand the question and the concern moving forward, but we can't predict the future and what happens. And certainly what we learned after Katrina and the Turner decision, even earlier than that in the 80s, was that a reawakening happened with the entire flood protection industry. As you can certainly appreciate, Natomas and New Orleans are the most flood.
I can appreciate it. I lived in New Orleans during 2 hurricanes.
Yeah, and so we're the most flood risky places in the United States. And while the levees were improved post-Katrina, most recently in Hurricane Ida, there was internal infrastructure that failed. And so I don't think that we can ignore this fact where obviously the entire flood industry's kind of awakened to new standards and a different way to think and address levees and to protect them. I can assure you that the images that all of you have seen during Katrina when people were fleeing to higher ground, that water temperature was on average between 65 and 72 degrees. When And if, and hopefully never, it happens in Natomas during our flood season, the average water temperature is minus 55 degrees on any incoming water from the Sacramento levee system. So you saw people fleeing in 65 to 72 degree water, fine to get to high ground. The human body loses muscle control after 3 minutes in 55 degree water or less. And so this is why Natomas, and that's the average temperature during our flood season. And so this is why Natomas is really high on the list, because you wouldn't see that fleeing out of the flood grounds and people wading through water. And so I can't predict the future. We're just literally offering you the opportunity to be informed about the decision you're making here in the next, that you've made in the prior 3 weeks and moving forward, to the extent that we can offer funding and help you guys out to come into compliance with those standards. That's what we're offering. If there's a potential next summer, if we are fortunate enough to receive grant funding for next year, we may be able to address that, depending on whether you're in enforcement action or not with the Central Valley Flood Protection for the Flood Protection Board at that point. I don't know, but we're again continuing. So the whole intent tonight was to make sure that you had, if you hadn't previously attended community meetings or reached out to us, to offer our assistance to educate you to this process, not debate you with what the standards are and what we see, because that's going to be the responsibility of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board through enforcement or the U.S. Army Corps engineer. And so we literally just want to make sure you're aware and offer one last opportunity as our contract is in place. Our contractor started expending those funds on Monday of this week. And so hopefully, this was helpful tonight. You will receive a postcard either directly in your box, Gabe's hand delivering those to the properties that actually have a physical mailbox. For those that we only have mail-in addresses from the county tax roll, you'll get that a week ahead of time, informing you that you have the opportunity to opt out or to stay in the program, but we'll be on site the following week. So we're sending those out. But please feel free at any time to reach out to us. We're keeping a running tabulation of those that have reached out. And so fortunately, I had your email addresses to invite you to the meeting tonight and just share our perspective and what we see.
Kevin, I'm going to hit a few more of the questions in the chat, but I want to clarify one thing you said just so that folks on the line can make sure they understand. If someone has already sent you an intent to opt out and they're not until a later phase, so they get a postcard saying you can opt out, do they need to let you know again, or is the opt out that they've already provided effective? And Kevin, you just came off mute.
Yeah, Scott, thanks for that clarification. So they will receive another postcard because we already have them pre-done per our schedule. They'll receive that postcard. If they've already opted out and they haven't confirmed that they want to opt back in, we will skip them this go round. But if they want a little bit more time, obviously we're working through our schedule and the contractor's proceeding down Garden Highway. If they have a change of opinion or want us to meet with them on site after they receive the postcard, we're certainly willing to do so. But at this point, we've received the opt-out. If they want to elect to come back in, please reach out to us. Otherwise, you will be skipped through this project this summer.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a helpful clarification. A few more questions in the chat, some of which I may lean again on Rick on. So CK, you have a few questions here, and I understand a few of them. Let me hit the ones I understand, and then we might ask you to clarify on the ones I don't. So you write 500,000 could pay the salary of someone to get out of the car and walk by a property for many years, offer camera systems or more advanced drones. Why don't other options get our input? And I'll first note that this money was through the state's flood maintenance assistance program, which does have certain restrictions on it. And my recollection is you can't use it to pay salary, for example. But you do ask other questions like, well, why aren't there better ways to inspect? And I can tell you that the visual inspection is the Army Corps of Engineers gold standard. Rick, in addition to being the certifying engineer, was formerly with the Corps. And I don't know, Rick, if you want to speak any more to why there isn't some newer way of, through coax cable or drones or something, of doing this inspection.
Yeah, well, I just reinforce the point you made, although I wouldn't say it's the gold standard. I would say that it is the standard and there is not another standard. And RD 1000 doesn't have input on this. That comes down from the Army Corps of Engineers. And so if you don't like their standard, the engagement is through the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And that's where there's a public forum for having discussion about what the requirements are in Title 23 and what the O&M manual states, but it's not something RD 1000 has latitude over complying with.
Thank you. CK, you also have a few in a row here. You write, in the 1968 Special Encroachment Standards document, there are different standards for properties with fill. The standards are different. Buildings, on 25.3, the 1968 document states fill properties have no restrictions on vegetation. Has RD 1000 read the 1968 Special Encroachment document? The 1969 Special Encroachment document was revised in 1985. Filled properties have no restrictions on vegetation. And I'm not sure what else we can say to that other than the point that Rick made, which is that we're dealing with a number of different authorities, both state as well as federal. And I think he has spoken as clearly as he can to the fill issue. Rick, is there anything from those comments or questions that you feel you can add?
Just one minor point, and that's that the new O&M manual, and for that matter, the existing O&M manual, are more restrictive than what's in Title 23. The state standards can be more restrictive than the Corps, but they can't be less restrictive. Kevin made the point earlier that the Protection Board is updating their Title 23 process. Kevin is part of the committee that's providing input to the board as they consider that update. And the existing Title 23 standards will need to be updated to reflect the changes in the current O&M manual once it's finalized.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, I see you've come on camera. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This is for Mr. King. Do you think that we're going to have hurricanes here like they did in Katrina in New Orleans? You keep mentioning that.
Yeah, so what I referenced was Hurricane Katrina and the devastation that happened with the levee. Obviously, California isn't subjected to annual hurricanes or tropical storms like they are in the South, but we are subjected to multiple events over the course of the last, 3 decades that we've seen the potential for devastating flood events in Sacramento. Sacramento has a long history dating back to the 1800s about flooding in downtown Sacramento and why levees were installed. And so, no, we aren't likely to have hurricanes, although who knows what happens with climate change, but we are significantly subjected to atmospheric rivers, depending on the snowpack and elevation changes. Just most as recently as 2017, we saw a spillway failure at Oroville that increased pressure on the levee system down at the confluence of our levee system. We had a property on Garden Highway that, because of the encroachments and lack of maintenance, it had been condemned and is going through enforcement action for unpermitted or unmaintained properties. And so we do recognize the potential for that, although certainly not hurricane related in our perspective right now. But we are at the confluence of 3 major river systems in California. We're at the tip of the spear for that, and just cautioning about what potentially could happen.
Kevin, if I can add to that, many of you might remember in October of this last year, we had the rainfall of record. It was about a 200-year rainfall event. But because we were coming out of a very dry season, that really didn't result in a lot of runoff. In December of this year, we had the snowfall of record at many of our gauging stations. Had those two things coincide, it would have been an event that was on the scale of a Katrina, a Harvey, a Sandy, and it would have been devastating. And so the threat is real. We've just been very fortunate that we've avoided it to date.
So continuing on, the next comment in the chat was from Mr. Tully. We declined because you didn't turn over discovery. Mr. Tully, I assume you're talking about our responses to Public Records Act requests, and Rebecca Smith worked with Kevin and his team to manage those. And so Rebecca, just for folks who may not have the background, perhaps you can speak briefly to what the requests were and how we responded and the extent of the responses.
Sure, yeah, so the requests were largely related to the existing standards that govern the levee vegetation. We provided them in 2 separate batches electronically as we pulled them together. We started with an early batch that was sort of the low-hanging fruit of everything we could easily grab without a really in-depth search, and then provided a secondary batch as well online. Those links were available for 90 days. If they, as I mentioned, we provided the most recent in early June. We can certainly re-up those as well. It's a pretty comprehensive universe of documents. It also includes as-built for the levees and quite a bit of information that the district holds. It of course is all public, and we're happy to share. So.
And Rebecca, are all of the outstanding Public Records Act requests responded to at this point, or are there any outstanding still? That's
correct. Yeah, everything has been responded. I would invite, if folks from the association, Mr. Tully or others, feel that response is somehow incomplete, we're happy to chat and figure out what you think might be missing. But it's a pretty comprehensive universe of documents, and we're comfortable that we've provided everything we've got.
Thank you. CK also wrote again about a conversation she had with Gabe about how this doesn't make sense on her property because it's fill. I do think we've spoken to that issue, and I'll invite you to put back in the chat if you think that there's more for us to say. Bambi noted that Katrina had absolutely no bearing on us in the Sacramento River, but I think Mr. Reinhardt and Mr. King have both talked about it's really that magnitude of event we're talking about. You're welcome, Mr. Ward, for the effort. CK, you write, is there any study or evidence-based data that shows seeing levees saves lives, or is this just a slogan to encode an emotional response? And I was going to ask Rick Reinhardt, who actually has been handling flood events for something more than 20 years in our region, to maybe give an example or two of where an inspection found something and what the result was of being able to find it in time.
Sure. The most common is burrowing rodents, but I also know that RD1000 has firsthand experience on the Garden Highway. There was some vegetation that blocked visibility, and it was found that a property owner had dug into the side of the levee and installed, I think it was a container, a wine cellar, into the side of the levee that wasn't visible because of that vegetation. And there are numerous examples in the Central Valley in all our major flood events where we've had levee failures associated with burrowing rodents and gophers, beavers, being able to see those. And in fact, in the Natomas Basin, I don't remember how many years ago, it was within the last 15 years, up on the Pleasant Grove Creek Canal levee in the northeast corner, we discovered a beaver den that went all the way into the levee. And had there been vegetation on the water side, or I can't remember how we found it, but it's things like that that are what we're trying to guard against, and making sure that we've got the ability to see the levee. And then, of course, there's erosion that is a primary driver throughout the system for levee failures.
And I can offer a number of cases that I've litigated on behalf of public agencies, including one north on the Sacramento River, where during a high water event, there was an inspection Due to there not being vegetation on the levee, the inspector did see water starting to flow through the levee through something. It turned out to be an old broken culvert that was there that no one knew about. And they were able to construct a cofferdam and stop that levee from failing. So yes, certainly the slogan is designed to get people's attention, but it is based on actual experiences that we've had. CK asked, were there any lives lost? And I'm unaware of lives being lost in a California flood event since 1955. And in 1955, there were, I think it was 30 something lives lost when a levee by Yuba City failed. And it failed during the night at a time that it was hard to inspect. They were aware that water started flowing through it. They didn't have the crew able to get out there to actually stop that flow at the time. And so we do have examples of dozens of lives lost during failed levees during flood events in Northern California.
Yeah, Scott, we also had lives lost in
1986
and 1997. Yeah,
I forgot about 1986. Richard Webb, who was the president of Reclamation District 784, his son died during the failure in 1986 when that levee failed. And then I don't remember if anyone passed in 1997. I don't remember if anyone died in the Meridian, but there are unfortunately many examples of people dying as a result of these failures. Mr. Kadick, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, said the issue with Oroville was reported to be due to poor maintenance. And I think our point isn't why it failed, but that if upstream events happen that are out of our control, they can put pressure on the levees, which necessitate the need to be able to inspect during those high water events. Daniel Cucci writes, I'm having trouble locating the variance document on the website. Someone had mentioned earlier that it could be found there. Kevin, is there a particular place or is it something that isn't there and we can get put up in the next day?
Yeah, we can absolutely post that. The Garden Highway Community Association has that document. I believe it was in the public records request. So, but we could definitely post that. It still is in draft form, obviously, because the Corps has not approved the supplement to Part 3 for the O&M manual for the vegetative variance to date.
Hey, Kevin, can I just clarify? The variance is final. It's the Part 3 supplement to the O&M manual that is in draft final form.
Yeah.
And so maybe for Mr. Cucci's benefit, instead of placing it on the RD1000 website where people are going to have trouble finding it, perhaps we can send a link out to everybody who attended tonight, and we can just put it up on the share site that Rebecca has used in order to share documents in response to the Public Records Act request, so that we can make sure that he has it. And Mr. Cucci, if that doesn't work, please respond in the chat, but I think that's probably the best way of making sure you can find it easily. And CK, the last comment that's in there right now, oh, now there's two, but you had written secondary to not being able to see a levee while driving by. I'm not sure I understand that. If you'd like to clarify, we'd be happy to address it. And then you write, lives were lost, question mark. None of what you mentioned had evidence of not being able to see a levee while driving by, leading to failure. No, I'm afraid it often doesn't work that way. We have lots of evidence of being able to see and there not being failure. I don't have necessarily cases of people couldn't see and it led to failure. Fortunately, we have an increasing track record of reduced damage to property and reduced loss of lives as a result of carefully implementing federal and state standards. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Rebecca, can you grab this?
Also, I do want to point out RD1000 has an obligation during enactment of our emergency response plan that when river elevations in the Sacramento or American River reach a certain stage, that we must continuously patrol 24/7 until those river stages are below the threshold for monitoring. And so in 2019, with a significant snowpack and elevated river elevations, the district did patrol continuously for 42 days straight, starting in or around February 14th, 2019. And part of that obligation for RD1000 is to provide continuous patrol of our exterior levee system as well as our interior levee system. And so this is real, it happens. And fortunately, we've been in a dry period for the past 2.5 years, at least from a levee protection standpoint, not speaking towards the water supply issues, but from RE 1000's perspective, we do have an obligation to enact our emergency action period, which requires continuous monitoring 24/7, and so that we can identify potential issues with the levee and ensure our flood protection system is operating appropriately.
Thank you, Kevin. I see, Mr. Tully, you posted at 45 miles an hour, a 100-foot lot will go by at 1.2 seconds. How much can you see? I guess I would invite either Mr. Reinhardt or Mr. King to talk about how those inspections go, because during a high water event, they're not driving at 45 miles an hour. I know, Rick, you've been in a number of them in person, and Kevin, fortunately, you haven't had as many since you're newer to the district, but I know you've had all the training, and I believe you've done some as well.
They're not driving by at 45 miles an hour. We're getting out, we're walking the levee. We're driving very slowly with spotlights looking for any indication that there's distress of the levee system.
Yep, that's correct. And as Rick pointed out earlier, October of this year, we had a significant storm event. We were dangerously close from failure of our internal infrastructure and putting water onto Interstate 80 and shutting down that transportation corridor. Fortunately, we were able to get our internal infrastructure back up and running in time, but we would have, they were about 2 inches away. And so this does happen. Fortunately, it happened at the beginning of our flood season, actually pre-flood season. And yeah, it happens. Even if you don't realize it's happening, it's going on. And as a local maintaining agency, I can't stress enough the importance and the existence of the Natomas community based on the levees that were constructed back in the early 1900s, 1911, you know, as the district's formation. So with that, I will conclude the meeting tonight. Again, for anyone who's opted out that based on the information provided tonight would like to opt back in, provided that we have the opportunity and the funding available, please let me know. If you want further information or an on-site consultation with myself or Gabe Holloman, depending on his availability and mine, please reach out to me immediately. Again, SWIFT, swif@rd1000.org will go to both Gabe and I, or you can reach out directly to me at kking@rd1000.org, and I'd be happy to respond. And so I appreciate your time tonight. Hopefully this was informative, and I wish you all a good evening, and we'll continue to work with you to address your concerns. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the call tonight, and hopefully we hear from you. Thank you.